I still hear her voice sometimes, like a splinter lodged behind my ear. "You're not fit to be a mother." She said it with such certainty, as if the truth was hers alone to declare. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, or even that she spat them across the polished courtroom floor for everyone to hear. It was that, for a moment, a single gutting moment, I believed her. My name is Jessica Hartman. I was 28 when I married Eric and 30 when our son, Eli, was born. I'd always imagined the start of our family would be tender, maybe even idyllic. But from the second Margaret, the woman who insisted I call her mother instead of Margaret, stepped through our front door with her thin smile and colder eyes, I felt something shift, like she'd walked in with a list of my failings already drafted. Even now, sitting in the stiff wooden chair beneath the humming lights of the courtroom, I can trace every step that brought me here, every slight, every accusation, every time she quietly told Eli, "Mommy doesn't know what she's doing, but Grandma will fix it." At first I told myself she meant well, that her controlling nature was just her way of showing love. But the longer I pretended, the more of myself I surrendered. I glanced across the aisle where she sat in her tailored navy suit, her hair in that severe twist she favored when she wanted to look respectable. She met my gaze with a tiny, satisfied lift of her chin. Margaret thrived in places like this, rooms where rules and performances determined outcomes. She knew exactly which mask to wear: the caring grandmother, the concerned mother-in-law, the moral authority. I looked at Eli, just 8 years old, his legs swinging beneath his chair. His small hand gripped the stuffed bear I'd packed in his bag that morning in case he needed something familiar to hold on to. When he caught my eye, his mouth pulled into a worried line. I forced a reassuring smile, though my own stomach was knotted so tight I could barely breathe. "Jessica Hartman," the bailiff announced, the echo bouncing off the walls. My heart tripped. This was it. The moment my entire life, Eli's life, could be decided. Margaret leaned forward, her voice a theatrical whisper that everyone could still hear. "You should have left him with someone competent," she hissed. "He'd have been better off." I closed my eyes. For years, I'd let her words burrow into me, eating away at any conviction I had that I was doing something right. I remembered the nights Eli had a fever, and I sat up rocking him while Margaret called Eric to say I was overreacting. The days I'd pack healthy lunches, only to find Margaret had delivered fast food to his school because she didn't trust me to feed him properly. I opened my eyes again and looked squarely at her. Not this time. Across the aisle, Eric refused to meet my gaze. He'd always been too spineless to challenge his mother. When she started hinting that maybe Eli would be safer in her care, he hadn't defended me. He'd only mumbled that maybe she has a point. That was when I knew I was alone in this. The judge shuffled the papers in front of her, glasses perched at the tip of her nose. "We will now hear testimony," she said, her voice crisp. My palms dampened against my skirt. I could feel my pulse in my throat. For all Margaret's poison, all the little barbs she'd laced into every conversation, this was the moment I would finally speak for myself and for Eli. I reached into my purse and touched the envelope I'd brought, the one that contained every documented lie, every voicemail, every text message. Proof that no matter what Margaret said, I had always been, and would always be, a mother worth fighting for. The judge looked up. "Ms. Hartman," she said, her tone almost gentle, "you may proceed." And for the first time in years, I felt something like hope. If you'd told me back then how it would end, I might have laughed, or cried, or maybe I'd have simply run. Taken Eli, packed our lives into a battered sedan, and disappeared to some place Margaret's voice couldn't reach. But I didn't, because the truth is, by the time her words turned venomous, she'd already spent years softening me up, like a hunter making the prey easier to catch. I met Eric when I was 25, working in a bookstore downtown. He was polite, patient, and made me feel seen in a way I hadn't since my own mother died. We married quickly. Too quickly, if you asked anyone who knew me well. And it wasn't long before I realized Margaret came attached to him like a second, sterner shadow. In the first year of our marriage, her criticisms were wrapped in silk. She would say things like, "Darling, I'm only suggesting this because I care," or "You'd want Eli to have the best, wouldn't you?" If I dressed Eli in the onesies I'd picked out with such care, she would sigh and replace them with something she called more appropriate. When I cooked dinner, she'd find a way to re-season it after I stepped out of the kitchen. When Eli started crawling, she said, "Be careful. You never were very coordinated." I tried to keep the peace. I told myself that letting her help would make things easier. After all, I didn't have family close by, and Eric worked long hours. Margaret was so sure of everything, so practiced in motherhood, that I started to question myself. I remember one night Eli was fussing and wouldn't settle. I was bone-tired, rocking him in the nursery, when Margaret came in without knocking. She didn't ask permission. She simply plucked him from my arms, pressed him against her chest, and cooed, "See, sweetheart, Grandma knows how to take care of you." I should have said something then. Should have reclaimed my baby and my authority in the same breath. But instead, I watched her rock him to sleep, and I stood there, feeling like an intruder in my own home. That was the first time a sliver of doubt cracked open in me, thin and cold. Margaret had a gift for making me feel incompetent. She wielded her experience as a weapon, reminding me at every turn that she'd raised 3 children without any of this nonsense, baby monitors and parenting books and all the fuss. When Eli developed a mild rash, she insisted it was because I didn't keep the house clean enough. When I found out later it was a reaction to laundry soap, she shrugged, "Better safe than sorry." Eric, to his shame, rarely intervened. I think he believed that if he pretended not to notice, the tension would dissolve on its own. If he stayed neutral, no one could blame him. But neutrality, I've learned, is its own kind of betrayal. Every time he refused to pick a side, he was choosing hers by default. The real trouble started the week after Eli turned 5. Margaret came over unannounced, as she always did, and found me crying in the kitchen. Eli had refused to eat, and after an hour of pleading and coaxing, I'd lost my temper and snapped at him. Nothing terrible, nothing more than any mother who hadn't slept in 3 days might say. But Margaret's eyes flickered when she saw my red-rimmed eyes. "I'm not surprised," she murmured. "Some people simply aren't cut out for motherhood." I tried to protest, but she held up a hand. "I know you're doing your best," she added, softening her tone in a way that only made it worse. "But maybe Eli would be happier with someone more stable." She let the word hang there, heavy as a curse. That evening, she took Eric aside in the living room. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught phrases, "for Eli's welfare," "not safe," "unfit." When he came back into the kitchen, he wouldn't meet my eyes. My heart sank. That was when the doubt she'd planted years before finally sprouted, tangling around my resolve. I lay awake that night with Eli's warm little body curled against me, wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was right. If maybe loving him wasn't enough. If maybe I really wasn't fit to be a mother. But in the morning, when Eli stirred and reached for me, blinking up with that sleepy trust, I knew I couldn't let her win. Even if I was exhausted, even if Eric wouldn't stand with me, he was my son. And I would not hand him over to someone who treated love like a competition. I wish I could say there was a single moment when everything snapped. That one unmistakable instant when Margaret's campaign against me transformed from meddling to something darker. But the truth is, it was a slow erosion, like water wearing away at rock, drop by drop, until all that was left was a hollowed-out version of who I'd once been. It started with whispers, Margaret telling Eric's aunts that Eli seemed nervous around me, hinting that perhaps I was too anxious to provide a stable home. She never said anything outright, nothing you could point to as slander, just small, insinuating comments planted at family gatherings over coffee and cake. I tried to counter it, to show everyone how much Eli adored me, how safe he was in my care. But no matter what I did, the rumors trailed me like a bad smell. I'd take Eli to the park, and one of Eric's cousins would appear on a nearby bench, pretending to read a magazine while watching me. If I scolded Eli when he bolted toward the street, I'd see her lean over her phone, texting someone. Probably Margaret. Then came the day everything changed. I still remember the knock. 3 sharp raps at the front door, so authoritative that my heart leapt into my throat. When I opened it, 2 women stood on the porch, their jackets crisp, badges clipped to their pockets. Child Protective Services. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Mrs. Hartman?" the taller one asked, her tone practiced and neutral. "We received a report about possible neglect in the home. We'd like to ask you a few questions." I stammered something, I don't even remember what, and stepped aside to let them in. Eli was sitting at the kitchen table with his crayons, oblivious. They introduced themselves to him gently before one of them turned back to me. "Do you mind if we have a look around?" I watched them open cupboards, check the fridge, inspect Eli's room. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the counter to stay upright. One of the women asked me about Eli's medical history, about discipline, about my mental health. "Do you feel overwhelmed?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I wanted to scream. Overwhelmed? Yes. Because for years, Margaret had been dismantling my life piece by piece. Because my husband refused to defend me. Because I was standing in my own kitchen answering questions about whether I deserved to keep my child. When they finally left, promising to file a report, I collapsed onto the floor. Eli climbed into my lap, wrapping his small arms around my neck. I buried my face against his hair and cried until my chest hurt. I knew, without a doubt, that Margaret was behind the call. She'd finally stopped hinting and started acting. I called Eric at work, my voice shaking. "Your mother called CPS on me," I said. "This is enough. You need to tell her to back off." There was a long pause. When he spoke, his voice was dull, resigned. "Jess, maybe she's just worried." That was it. The last sliver of hope that Eric might stand beside me withered and died. That night, I packed a bag for Eli and drove to a motel across town. As he slept in the lumpy bed, I sat in the dark thinking about what to do next. I knew I couldn't outrun her. Margaret had money, connections, and decades of experience getting what she wanted, but I had something she didn't. I had Eli's trust, his love, and I had the truth. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I told her everything, every manipulative comment, every undermining gesture, every time Margaret had swooped in to fix something that wasn't broken. "She'll try to paint you as unstable," my lawyer warned. "She'll have people willing to testify against you, but if you have records, proof, you can fight this." I thought about the voicemails I'd saved, the text messages, the incident reports I'd quietly filed when Margaret showed up at Eli's school uninvited. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue instead of defending myself. No more. That night, I called Eric and told him I was filing for full custody. His stunned silence told me he never believed I'd have the courage. But as I looked at Eli sleeping beside me, his small hand curled around mine, I knew there was no turning back. Margaret had underestimated me. She thought she could break me down until I disappeared, but she'd only taught me how to fight, and I was ready. I thought filing for custody would bring some relief, like stepping onto solid ground after years of feeling like I was drowning. But the first court date arrived faster than I was ready for, and any illusion of safety dissolved as soon as I saw Margaret seated beside her lawyer, her face a perfect mask of concern. I remember gripping the edge of the counsel table so hard my knuckles went white. My lawyer, Angela, leaned over and murmured, "Stay calm. They want you to look hysterical." It was almost funny. I'd spent years trying to convince everyone, including myself, that I was calm, capable, unshakable. Now I realized that in Margaret's narrative, I'd never stood a chance. I was either too emotional or too cold, too protective or too inattentive. She'd twisted every version of me into something ugly. When the hearing began, Margaret's lawyer rose first. She spoke in that oily, rehearsed voice that made my skin crawl. "Your Honor, we have grave concerns about Ms. Hartman's ability to provide a stable environment for Eli." I felt my throat close. Grave concerns. Margaret folded her hands over her purse, nodding solemnly like she hadn't orchestrated every word. The lawyer continued, outlining a version of my life that sounded foreign and monstrous. She claimed I was prone to emotional outbursts, that Eli was often unkempt, that I was isolating him from his paternal family. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Eli was clean, happy, and loved. He'd never gone a day without a warm meal or a hug. But in this courtroom, Margaret's story had the veneer of truth, polished and supported by the witnesses she'd lined up. Eric's cousin, who'd seen me crying in the grocery store. A neighbor who once heard me raise my voice when Eli wouldn't come inside. Angela stood and objected to the baseless claims, but each time Margaret's lawyer spoke, I could feel the tide rising against me, and then came the moment that nearly broke me. The lawyer called Eric to the stand. He moved stiffly, not meeting my eyes. My stomach dropped. "Mr. Hartman," the lawyer began smoothly, "would you say your wife struggles to cope with day-to-day parenting responsibilities?" Eric's jaw twitched. For a second, I prayed he might finally defend me, that he might remember all the nights he came home to find Eli bathed and fed and sleeping peacefully, that he'd remember the woman he married, not the caricature Margaret had created, but he only nodded. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "she gets overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. The word echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off every hard surface and landing square in my chest. I felt the tears prick behind my eyes, but I swallowed them down. If Margaret wanted me to crumble here in front of everyone, she'd be disappointed. Angela stood to cross-examine, her voice steady as she asked Eric if he'd ever seen Eli harmed, if he'd ever had cause to fear for his son's safety. Eric shifted, looking anywhere but at me. "No," he admitted. "She's never hurt him." It was something, at least. But the damage was done. I could see it in the judge's careful expression, how difficult it would be to untangle the truth from Margaret's carefully woven net. After the testimony ended, we took a recess. I sat alone in the hallway, my hands folded in my lap, trying not to shake. Eli was with the court-appointed child advocate in a small room nearby. Part of me wanted to barge in and take him home. Part of me wanted to run as far from this place as I could get. But I didn't move. Instead, I thought about Margaret, about her smug little smiles and her endless, poisonous words, about how she'd spent years trying to strip me of everything, my confidence, my marriage, my motherhood, and I realized she hadn't succeeded yet. When the recess ended, I stood. My legs felt heavy, but I walked back into that courtroom with my head high, because no matter how many lies Margaret told, no matter how many people she recruited to her cause, she could never erase the bond between me and my son. She could try to take everything else, but she would never take that. When the judge called my name, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the quiet rage that had been simmering for years, or maybe it was the memory of Eli's face pressed against my shoulder the night before, his voice muffled as he whispered, "Don't let them take me." I rose from my chair, smoothing my skirt with hands that had finally stopped trembling. As I walked to the witness stand, I caught Margaret watching me, her lips curved into the faintest smile. She looked so sure of herself, so certain that all her plotting had already won. For a moment, I almost let that look get to me. Almost. But then I remembered every time she'd called me silly, emotional, unfit. Every time I'd stood in my own kitchen and felt like a guest. Every time she'd tried to claim Eli as hers. I swore I would never let her do it again. The clerk administered the oath, and I lifted my chin. My voice shook on the first words, but I didn't care. I would not be silent anymore. Angela approached the stand. She didn't offer me a comforting smile. She knew I didn't need comfort. I needed strength. Miss Hartman, she began, can you describe your relationship with your son? I drew in a breath. Eli is my entire world, I said, my voice firm. From the moment he was born, I've loved him more than anything. I have never neglected him, never harmed him. Every decision I've made has been to keep him safe and happy. Angela nodded, her tone steady. Have you ever denied Eli contact with his grandmother? No, I said, but I have tried to set boundaries that Margaret has refused to respect. Margaret's lawyer rose to object, but the judge held up a hand. Miss Hartman, please elaborate. So I did. I told them about the unannounced visits, the times Margaret showed up at Eli's school without my permission. I explained how she criticized everything I did, how she told Eli that Mommy doesn't know how to take care of you, how she'd replaced the food I packed with her own, brought him gifts I'd explicitly asked her not to give, and ignored every limit I tried to set. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, the words coming faster as years of resentment and fear finally cracked open. She's tried to undermine me from the beginning, I said, and when that didn't work, she resorted to lies. She called Child Protective Services and claimed I was neglecting my son. She told people I was unstable, but none of that is true. I reached into the file I'd brought and lifted out the manila envelope I'd kept hidden until this moment. Angela took it from my hands and passed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, this is evidence of a coordinated effort to defame Ms. Hartman. It includes voicemails, text messages, and witness statements from neighbors who have observed the respondent's behavior. The judge opened the file and began to read. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Margaret shifted in her seat, the smugness slowly draining from her face. Angela continued, her voice low but resolute. Your Honor, this is not a case of a concerned grandmother. This is a pattern of harassment and manipulation designed to strip my client of her parental rights. I looked at Eric then, hoping foolishly that he might finally see the damage his mother had caused, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I wondered if he was ashamed or simply relieved to let someone else fight this battle. Either way, I no longer cared. When the judge finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. Ms. Hartman, she said, thank you for your testimony. You may return to your seat. I stood, my legs steady beneath me. As I passed Margaret, I met her gaze. For the first time, she looked uncertain, small, like a woman who'd finally realized she might not win after all. I sat down beside Angela, feeling the strangest thing, calm. Because whatever happened next, I knew I had spoken every truth I'd been forced to swallow, and the court had heard me. I dreamed of this moment countless times, imagining Margaret's face when the truth finally outshone her lies. But in reality, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, like the hush before a storm breaks. The judge lifted the manila folder and flipped through the contents, her glasses perched low on her nose. Page after page, she read in silence. Each turn of paper felt like a verdict in itself. I kept my gaze fixed on Eli's small shoes, peeking out from the adjoining room where he was being looked after. He'd been so brave, clutching his bear and whispering, "Don't be scared, Mommy." I wished I could hug him. Angela rested a hand lightly on my forearm. She didn't need to say anything. Her touch said everything, that she believed me, that she was in this fight with me. Ms. Hartman, the judge said, looking over the rims of her glasses, these messages, are they all from the respondent? Yes, Your Honor, I said, my voice clear. Every single one. She nodded and continued reading. Margaret shifted in her seat. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but for once she didn't look so composed. Her hand fluttered to her necklace, twisting the gold pendant nervously. The bailiff distributed copies of the evidence packet to both sides. As Margaret leafed through the pages, I watched the color drain from her cheeks. I'd included everything. The text she'd sent Eric. She can't even keep her own house clean. Maybe Eli would be better off here. The voicemail she'd left me in the middle of the night. You're going to lose him. Everyone knows you're not fit. The incident reports from the school. the signed statement from our pediatrician confirming Eli had never shown any signs of neglect, even the emails she'd sent to Eric's family, peppered with half-truths designed to make me look like an unhinged mother. For years, I'd kept those records because some small, stubborn part of me had known this day might come. It was the only proof I had that I wasn't imagining it all, that Margaret's campaign to ruin me was real, calculated, and cruel. Margaret's lawyer cleared her throat. "Your Honor, we would like to question the authenticity of these materials." Angela didn't even flinch. "All messages were verified by an independent digital forensics specialist. We can provide testimony if necessary." The judge raised a hand. "That won't be required at this time." She set the folder down, folding her hands. "It is clear this case is more complicated than it first appeared." Margaret finally looked at me, her eyes wide. For the first time, I saw something other than contempt in her gaze. I saw fear. "Miss Hartman," the judge continued, "have you sought any assistance or counseling to help you cope with these events?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been in therapy for over a year. I've done everything I can to make sure Eli is safe and loved." The judge's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "And have there been any incidents of harm or neglect regarding your son?" "No, Your Honor," I said firmly. "Never." The air felt heavy as the judge turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Hartman," she said, her tone measured, "do you have any response to these materials?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. For a woman who had always known exactly what to say to cut me down, she seemed utterly lost. Her lawyer finally spoke up, but even she sounded uncertain. "Your Honor, my client was only acting out of concern." The judge lifted an eyebrow. "Concern is not justification for harassment." She turned her gaze back to me. "Thank you, Miss Hartman. You may return to your seat." As I walked back, I felt a strange lightness in my chest, like I'd finally dropped a burden I'd been carrying for so long I'd stopped feeling its weight. I sat down and let out a slow breath. Angela leaned close and whispered, "You did everything right." I didn't respond. I just closed my eyes and thought of Eli, of the life we might finally have, free from the constant fear that someone would snatch him away. And for the first time in years, I believed it was possible. The day the verdict was scheduled, I woke before dawn, unable to shake the feeling that everything in my life was balanced on a knife's edge. One word from the judge could change everything, for me, for Eli, for the fragile hope I'd been daring to let grow. I dressed carefully, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my skirt, then braided my hair to keep my hands busy. Eli stirred as I zipped my bag. "Mommy, do you have to go back to court?" he whispered, his voice still husky with sleep. I bent over and kissed his forehead. "Just one more time," I promised. "Then we'll be okay." As I left him with the child advocate, I felt something deep in my chest tighten and hold. No matter how confident Angela seemed, I couldn't pretend I wasn't afraid. In the courtroom, Margaret sat ramrod straight, her lawyer fussing over a stack of papers that wouldn't matter anymore. For all the preparation, all the strategies, the outcome now rested in the hands of one woman, sitting behind a tall wooden bench. The judge entered, and everyone stood. My knees felt unsteady, but I held my ground. I wouldn't let Margaret see me falter. Not today. "Please be seated," the judge said, her voice calm but laced with finality. She glanced down at the file in front of her, the same file that contained every lie Margaret had tried to spin into truth. I focused on my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale, like my therapist had taught me. When the judge began to speak, the words came in a slow, measured cadence that made my heart beat harder. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," she began, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "It is clear that there has been a protracted conflict over the custody and care of the minor child, Eli Hartman." I felt my palms grow damp against my skirt. Margaret didn't look at me this time. She stared straight ahead, her mouth pinched tight. "The role of the court," the judge continued, "is not to assign blame for the breakdown of familial relationships, but to determine what environment will best serve the welfare of the child." Angela's hand brushed mine under the table, steadying, anchoring me in the moment. "There is no credible evidence," the judge said, her voice rising just slightly, "to suggest that Ms. Hartman has ever neglected or endangered her son." A tremor ran through me so fierce I almost missed the next words. "On the contrary," she went on, "the record demonstrates that Ms. Hartman has consistently provided a stable, loving home and has made every reasonable effort to maintain healthy boundaries despite persistent interference." Margaret sucked in a sharp breath, but I didn't look her way. My gaze stayed fixed on the judge, willing myself to absorb each syllable. "It is the decision of this court," she said, pausing as if to let the moment settle over us all, "that full, legal and physical custody of Eli Hartman is hereby awarded to his mother, Jessica Hartman." The words felt unreal, like I'd conjured them in a desperate dream, but when the gavel fell, a final decisive knock of wood against wood, I knew it was real. Margaret's lawyer began to protest, something about visitation rights and appeals, but I didn't hear it. My ears were ringing, my vision blurring with sudden, unstoppable tears. Angela leaned closer. "You did it," she whispered, her voice fierce and gentle all at once. "You protected him." I nodded, pressing my trembling hands over my mouth as relief broke over me in waves. All the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was enough, if I could ever be strong enough to stand against her, it all melted away under the simple, irrevocable truth. I had been enough. I had always been enough. When I finally stood, Margaret was staring at me. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with something close to disbelief. For the first time, she had nothing to say, and that silence was sweeter than any victory speech I could have given. As I turned to leave, I caught Eric watching me. There was something hollow in his expression, as though he'd finally realized the cost of never taking a side, but I felt no urge to comfort him. He had made his choices. So had I. When I stepped out into the corridor, the air felt cleaner than it had in years. I closed my eyes and let the knowledge settle in my bones. Eli was safe, and no one, no matter how determined, could ever take that from me again. The day after the verdict, I woke up in a place that finally felt like ours. The townhouse wasn't much, 2 bedrooms with creaky floors and a kitchen that needed work. But when I stepped through the door carrying Eli on my hip, it felt like crossing a threshold into the life we deserved. No more unannounced visits, no more whispered accusations, no more living under someone else's thumb. Eli ran from room to room, his little feet thumping across the hardwood. He picked the smaller bedroom, declaring it perfect for his dinosaurs. I laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. That first night, I tucked him into his new bed, kissed his forehead, and lingered in the doorway just to watch him breathe. For the first time since he was born, I knew that no one could swoop in and decide they loved him more, deserved him more, or knew better. He was mine, and I was his. I thought I'd feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated, but mostly I felt tired. The sort of bone-deep exhaustion you only feel after you've held yourself together for too long. In the weeks that followed, there were practical things to handle. Updating school records, finalizing the custody paperwork, making sure Eli had stability. But under all the errands and signatures, I began to feel something grow in the quiet spaces between tasks. Peace. One afternoon, as I folded Eli's laundry, my phone buzzed. For a moment, my stomach clenched the way it always had when Margaret called. But this time, it wasn't her number. It was Eric's. I stared at the screen for a long minute before I answered. "Hello?" His voice was cautious. "Jess, I just wanted to see how Eli's doing." "He's fine," I said. "We're both fine." There was a long silence. I could almost hear the regret in his breathing. "My mother," She's not taking this well. I closed my eyes. That's not my problem anymore. He hesitated. I know, I guess I just didn't realize how far she'd go. I almost laughed. That's because you never wanted to see it. Maybe, he admitted. I'm sorry. I let the words hang in the air, feeling nothing. Maybe I'd needed to hear that once, but not now. I hope you can be a good father to Eli, I said finally, but you won't be doing it by undermining me. He exhaled, sounding older than I remembered. I understand. When I hung up, I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. I felt free. A week later, Margaret showed up on the front porch. She looked smaller than I remembered somehow, older. Her hands twisted around each other the way they had in court when she realized she'd lost. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. Jessica, she said quietly, I only wanted what was best for Eli. I know you believe that, I said. She looked past me, trying to see into the living room. Could I just say hello? I thought about all the years she'd tried to make me feel small, the nights I'd lain awake, terrified she'd find a way to take my son, the way her words had carved into me, deep enough I'd almost believed them. But that was over now. You can see him, I said calmly, but not here, not like this. From now on, everything goes through the visitation schedule, and you will respect my boundaries. For a second, she looked like she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped. She nodded, her eyes glistening with something I couldn't quite name. I shut the door, slowly, gently, and when the latch clicked into place, I felt something heavy fall away inside me. Eli came running around the corner, holding a crayon drawing in his hands. "Look, Mommy," he beamed. "It's us!" I knelt and took the picture. 2 stick figures, one big, one small, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Above our heads, in careful block letters, he'd written, "Mommy and me." I hugged him so tight he squeaked. In that moment, I knew Margaret could never break us again, because she'd built her power on my fear, and I didn't have any left to give her. We were finally free. And no matter what anyone said, I had proven to everyone, especially to myself, that I was and always had been fit to be a mother.